Okay, well, welcome to our virtual symposium. And my name is Kathryn Dungy. I am professor of history at St. Michael's College in Vermont. And today, in honor of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, I'm actually going to give a talk on the centennial of the March in 1913 on the for the March for women's suffrage. And I'm going to look at it through the lens of African American women, and specifically the only African American women's organization that was able to march in the march. There were other African American women there, but this was the only group that was able to get together for that. So the title of the talk is "The Courage of Their Convictions: African American Women in the Fight for Women's Suffrage." So in 1915, African American suffrage leader Nannie Helen Burroughs proclaimed, "When the ballot is put in the hands of the American woman, the world is going to get a correct estimate of the Negro woman. It will find her a tower of strength of which poets have never sung, orators have never spoken, and scholars have never written." On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution officially granted women the right to vote. 100 years later, many of the Black women who joined the long struggle toward the amendment have been forgotten. The 19th Amendment enfranchised 26 million American women, and but the 1920 victory did not guarantee voting rights for women of color. Despite their fervent participation in the suffrage struggle, it failed to fully enfranchise African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native American women. Their voting rights were only secured with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. As with many aspects of American political life, the suffrage movement was largely segregated, with white leaders such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul excluding or overshadowing African Americans. Yet, Black suffragists formed their own organizations, led parades, led marches, and unflaggingly petitioned for all women to have the right to vote, regardless of race or ethnicity. Today, we're going to look at the suffrage movement through the lens of one such women's organization that holds the distinction of being the only African American organization to participate in the 1913 suffrage parade. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was founded on January 13th, 1913, by 22 collegiate women at Howard University to promote academic excellence and provide assistance to those in need. The organization has a long storied history of civic engagement and political activism. Less than 2 months after the formation of the sorority, the new members participated in what would be their very first public effort for civil rights. On March 3rd, 1913, the new organization, along with between 5,000 and 10,000 other women, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in support of women's voting rights. Over this past century, Delta Sigma Theta members have been actively involved with and supportive of civil rights initiatives by strategically engaging in both indirect and direct action. Today, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated is the largest African American women's organization in the world, and has a global membership of over 200,000 college-educated women. The word Delta means change, and change is good. The 22 founders of Delta Sigma Theta sought to bring change upon an American landscape that embraced overt racism and sexism as acceptable aspects of everyday life. Since its inception, the sorority has maintained a constant focus on using its position in society to promote higher standards in human treatment and to improve race and gender relations. But don't let the word sorority fool you. There are 9 historically African-American fraternities and sororities. Collectively, they are referred to as the Divine Nine. Amid racial oppression and segregation, these elite groups of educated Blacks did not confine their concerns to college campuses. They assumed the charge of activism, scholarship, social uplifting, service to the greater community. And unlike their white counterparts, membership in African-American sororities and fraternities is not just a collegiate experience. It is a lifelong commitment. Alumni comprise 75% of the active membership of these groups. In the interest of full disclosure, I joined Delta Sigma Theta at the alumni level. That's me. The 4 major Black sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta, Zeta Phi Beta, and Sigma Gamma Rho, were founded over a 14-year period a century ago to provide sisterhood to the relatively few Black women who were attending college. Black sororities were conceived of as safe spaces on college campuses for Black women to share a sisterhood, support intellectual achievements, and develop leadership skills. Black sororities seek to improve the American experience of African Americans, of people of color, and of women across the country. In those early years of their existence, these sororities, like nearly all of Black America, were shut out from many economic opportunities and barred from participating in the political process. But Black women have been political activists since slavery and are proficient innovators of new approaches to political activities. Leveraging their college education and experiences, the sororities focused on the things they could control, like their appearance, their behavior, community organization, and education. The women were deeply influenced by the politics of respectability and the pressure to consistently be twice as good as their peers. This culturally conservative political stance emerged as part of a strategy to combat injustice by being above reproach and striving in their work ethic, conduct, and achievement. Now, outside of the Black communities, the political influence, the social and action initiatives, and the economic development rendered by Black Greek letter organizations often goes unnoticed. Likewise, on college campuses, particularly those outside of the historically Black colleges and universities, the general student body is also largely unaware of the extent Black sororities work, of the extent of work Black sororities are doing, and their contributions to the expansive national programs in areas like education, health, and promotion of strong families. In 1913, women were not guaranteed the right to vote. There were no women serving in Congress. There were no female cabinet secretaries. The Women's Suffrage Parade, organized in support of a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote, took place on March 3rd, 1913, one day before Woodrow Wilson became the 28th president of the United States. Organized quickly in a 2-month time period by activist Alice Paul, the Capitol's first suffrage parade was timed to put pressure on Woodrow Wilson the day before his inauguration. Marching against the status quo was not easy for white women, but it was even more difficult for African American women. White suffragists who did not favor suffrage for white suffragists did not favor suffrage for Black women. In a decision leading to the passage of the 15th Amendment to the United States, we even harken back to suffragists who did not favor suffrage for Black men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony made it clear as the 15th Amendment was coming through and being argued on, that they did not support Black male suffrage unless women also had the right to vote. And when they were speaking of women, they were very clear that they meant white women. In response to several inquiries into the march and who would be able to march in the procession, Alice Paul, a white woman who was in charge of the parade, was convinced that other white women would not want to march with Black women. Her response to several inquiries was to quietly attempt to discourage Black women from participating. She even confided her fears to a sympathetic newspaper editor, saying, "As far as I can see, we must have a white procession, or a Negro procession, or no procession at all." Despite the fact that the right to vote was no less important to Black women than it was to Black men and white women, African American women were told to march at the back of the parade with a Black procession. From the outset, authorities were worried about the threat to security from male onlookers, particularly the hard-drinking Southern Democrats who were celebrating the victory of a Virginia-born president. They suggested holding the event the day after the inauguration and perhaps stroll down 16th Street, a safe distance from the Bowery. But Alice Paul rallied support and went to the press, and they eventually decided to open Pennsylvania Avenue to the women, as the Washington Times urged, because that was where the men marched. Paul did get her way. Lured by the promise of a parade unlike any Washington had ever seen, the first spectators began to arrive at 9 a.m. on March 3rd, 6 hours early. By the time the trumpets sounded and the parade began, some 250,000 people lined Pennsylvania Avenue. Leading the way from the Capitol to the Treasury Department was a horse-drawn float bearing a banner that read, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, enfranchising the women of the country." It was followed by more floats, 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds with trumpets, and somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 women. A participant later wrote about that day, "The violence erupted minutes after the parade began. The crowd broke through steel cables and spilled into the streets. Men, many of them drunk, spit on the marchers and grabbed their clothing, hurled insults and lighted cigarettes, snatched banners and tried to climb floats. Protesters were pushed and shoved and tripped and spat upon and injured, and the police didn't hold the mobs back. The police did little to keep order. I didn't know men could be such fiends." By the end of the day, 100 marchers were taken to the local emergency hospital. The protesters had to have known that there would be a great risk to them and their safety. But women, Black and white, traveled across the country to make their voices heard. Alice Paul, for her part, was far from displeased at the outcome. The parade, including the violence, was front page news across America. It drew attention to suffragists and their cause. For its part, also, a fledgling sorority hatched just 6 weeks earlier, only blocks away, could already claim a proud history. Black women felt like they were under attack long before the crowds descended on the marchers. They had to fight just to be included in the procession. Aware they were not wanted, fearful they might be attacked, they still proceeded to the march. The 22 founding members of Delta Sigma Theta joined the procession, regardless of the news about possible violence. Among the Black activists, the prevailing view was that if white women needed to vote to secure their rights, Black women needed it even more. The sorority was helped in their decision by mentors Mary Church Terrell, Ida Wells Barnett, and Sadie T.M. Alexander, leading members of the African American activist community, and all of whom would soon become influential members of the fledgling organization. Black suffragette Ida B. Wells Barnett, a journalist who had awakened the nation to the injustices of lynching young Black men, connected women's rights to the Jim Crow disenfranchisement of Black men. She commented in 1910 that with no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. Despite her contributions to the movement, Wells Barnett was consistently and continually snubbed by white activists. Wells Barnett asked to march with the Illinois delegation. When word got into the newspapers, Southern suffragettes threatened to boycott. Wells Barnett's delegation was told to march at the end of the parade because the rest of the Illinois delegation wanted to keep it entirely white. So much publicity surrounded preparations for the parade that women from many states and other countries made travel plans to attend. But similar to flaws inherent in the 19th Amendment, the potential of the National American Women's Suffrage Organization was also tempered by exclusionary and racist practices. Organizer Alice Paul was radicalized by suffragettes in Britain. She feared the optics of an integrated parade, but she feared even more letting a suffrage conflict over race get into the newspapers. The Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time setting the status of Negroes in the Washington parade, read the Crisis, the instrument of the of the NAACP, National Association of Colored People. In 1913, the quote continues, "At first, Negro callers were received coolly at headquarters. Then they were told to register, but found that the registry clerk was usually out. Finally, an order went out to segregate them in the parade, but telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance." Ida B. Wells Barnett traveled to Washington, D.C. with the Illinois delegation and fully expected to march with them. As the group was lining up to begin the procession, white suffrage leaders suddenly asked Wells Barnett not to march with her fellow suffragettes from Illinois, and instead assume a place at the back of the procession. Wells Barnett was not one to follow through on suggestions such as this. She refused and left the area. But then she waited alongside the road on Pennsylvania Avenue until the Illinois group marched by. Then she and two white allies stepped in front of the Illinois delegation and continued in the procession. Although it's sometimes reported that African American women marched in the back of the procession, the crisis reported that more than 40 Black women processed in their state delegations with their respective professions, such as nurses and teachers. 2 were reported to have carried the lead banner for their sections. In their first public act, the 22 members of the new Delta Sigma Theta sorority marched in cap and gown with university women from all over the nation. Joining them were 6 African American graduates of predominantly white universities, 4 of whom would become influential members of the sorority. And they included Mary Church Terrell, Sadie T.M. Alexander, and Ida B. Wells. In spite of the apparent reluctance of the local suffrage committee to encourage the colored women to participate, and in spite of the conflicting rumors that were circulated and which disheartened many of the colored women from taking part, there are to be congratulated that so many of them had the courage of their convictions and that they made such an admirable showing in the first great national parade. So while hurtful sentiments and actions such as those revealed about the 1913 march are why some African American women even today do not indulge in any type of nostalgia for the suffrage movement, there's a larger story here. And that is that women of color, while they were discriminated against by the suffrage movement, they persevered. They did march, they did sign petitions, and eventually they did vote. Most of all, they never stopped trying. Memories of parades fade, just like old photographs. But for those who were least welcome, the 1913 suffrage parade has become a touchstone. In 2013, in recognition of the organization's centennial year, Delta Sigma Theta sorority organized a commemorative march. Because, as the organization's director of public relations so aptly put it, everybody who has been a member of this organization knows about the march. The founders could have had a social, they could have had a tea, but they did not. They chose to be committed to advocacy and social action. On March 3rd, 2013, 100 years after the first historic march, the women of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, in all of our crimson and cream glory, led the suffrage centennial celebration march in Washington, D.C. So, in doing so, they showed the world what it means to be an American woman, and that all African American women have contributed to make the nation what it is today. Political power may not be all that Black women are after. Historically, it has been the humanity, compassion, and courage of Black women that has set them apart, gotten them through their most difficult times, and made a difference in America. Since its inception, Delta Sigma Theta sorority's involvement in the political sphere has taken a wide variety of forms, including lobbying efforts, voter registration, and supporting members running for public office. Leadership through service and sisterhood are binding ethos of the sorority, and members have been proactively and passionately at the forefront of movements for equality and social justice over the past 107 years. Since its founding, Delta Sigma Theta has become one of the largest organizations of African and African diasporic women in the world. Its growth is due in large part to its reputation as a civically engaged membership. It has contributed significantly to race and gender rights globally. Although members' contributions have been diverse, most notable among them are advances in civil rights, public policy, philanthropy, education, and community service. The sorority counts in its membership political and civil rights luminaries, such as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm from New York, who was the first Black woman elected to Congress ever. And she was also the first Black woman to run from on a major party ticket for President of the United States. We also have Representative Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was the first African American elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction, and also the first Southern African American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Senator Kara Mosley Braun was the first African American woman elected to the U.S. Senate ever, and she was also only the second Black senator since Reconstruction. We have multiple members in the House and Senate. In 2019, there were 6 members of Delta Sigma Theta who were in the House. There are also multiple other leaders across the board. I mentioned Ida B. Wells Barnett, investigative journalist, civil rights advocate. Mary Church Terrell was a civil rights advocate and also past president of the National Association of Colored Women. Sadie T.M. Alexander was the first Black woman to receive a PhD in economics in the United States of America. She was also the first Black woman to receive a law degree and the first to be admitted to the Pennsylvania bar. Mary McLeod Bethune worked with Franklin Delano Roosevelt on many of his civil actions, and she was also the founder of the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute, which became Cookman College, and the National Council for Negro Women. Dorothy Height, Dr. Dorothy Height, spent 40 years as president of the National Council of Negro Women. Ambassador Patricia Roberts Harris was the first African-American woman to represent the United States as an ambassador. She was ambassador to Luxembourg, and she was also the first African-American Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Marcia Fudge was representative of Ohio, and she was also the 2016 Democratic National Convention chair. Merle Evers Williams is a civil rights activist and journalist. The U.S. Surgeon General, our first African-American and second female U.S. Surgeon General, was Jocelyn Edwards, also a soror. Secretary of U.S. Labor, Alex Herman, was the first African-American in her position. So then I have pictured here the Senate hearings for Loretta Lynch. And Loretta Lynch became the first Black woman to serve as the United States Attorney General. It was a contentious selection, and to show support to a soror, and then also just to a Black woman trying to do her thing. Many sorors of Delta Sigma Theta showed up, but sorors from all of the other Divine Nine also showed up in colors in support, showing the political activism and the social strength of Black women in politics. So, to close this out, it's been a long history, it's been a long struggle. The struggle is not over. Representative Marcia Fudge said of Delta Sigma Theta, it's an organization of leaders, and we expect to continue to bring leaders along. We think it's our responsibility and our obligation. We focus on political awareness and involvement in the community. We make sure anybody can run for school board or city council. Anybody can be the head of the PTA. Anybody can be involved in some policy-making arena that will allow us to get an agenda out. So we really do try to start people at the most basic level and then hopefully continue to move them forward. This was the goal of the founders in 1913. It is still the goal of the organization who, in its 107th year of existence, is still forging new forms of political sisterhood. Thank you very much.